The iron shackles bit into Sarah Ellen's wrists as two men dragged her up the wooden steps to the auction platform, her bare feet slipping on ice that had formed overnight in the town square of Fort Smith, Arkansas. January wind cut through her threadbare dress like knives, and she could see her breath forming white clouds in the freezing air as dozens of rough men gathered below, their eyes hungry and calculating. She had never imagined her life would come to this, standing on a platform like livestock while the auctioneer warmed his hands over a brazier and prepared to sell her to the highest bidder. It had been 3 weeks since her father died of influenza, leaving behind nothing but debts to every merchant and moneylender in town. The landlord had come first, then the grocer, then men she had never even seen before, all waving papers they claimed her father had signed. When she could not pay, they took everything, the furniture, her mother's wedding ring, even the winter coat that might have kept her warm on a morning like this January day in 1884. Then Judge Crawley, corrupt as the day was long, had declared her an indentured servant to be sold to cover the remaining debts. It was barely legal, riding the edge of laws that should have protected her, but in Fort Smith, what Judge Crawley said became reality. "Gentlemen, gentlemen." The auctioneer's voice boomed across the square. "We have here Miss Sarah Ellen, age 22, healthy, can read and write, cook, sew, and keep a house. Bidding starts at $50. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to block out the leering faces. Her dark hair whipped around her face in the bitter wind, and she could no longer feel her toes. She thought of her mother, dead these past 5 years, and wondered if this shame would have killed her all over again. $50, called a voice from the crowd. 60, shouted another. Sarah opened her eyes and scanned the crowd. Most of the men she recognized. There was Otto Brenner, who ran the saloon and employed girls in ways that made decent folk look away. There was Samuel Hutchins, whose last 3 wives had all died under mysterious circumstances. There was Marcus Delroy, known for his temper and his heavy fists, each face worse than the last. 75, 80, the price climbed, and with each increase, Sarah felt her future darken. She pulled against the shackles, but the metal held firm. The deputy standing behind her grabbed her shoulder to keep her still. $100. Otto Brenner's voice rang out confidently. The crowd went quiet. That was a substantial sum, more than most working men saw in months. Sarah's stomach turned. She knew exactly what kind of work he would expect from her. The auctioneer raised his gavel. $100. Going once. Sarah looked desperately around the crowd, though she did not know what she hoped to find. Most of the decent folk had stayed home, unwilling to witness this spectacle or powerless to stop it. The few faces she recognized as kind looked away in shame. Going twice. Then she saw him. A man standing at the back of the crowd, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat and a dark hat pulled low against the wind. Even from a distance, she could see the strong line of his jaw and the intense focus in his eyes as he watched the proceedings. There was something different about him, something that did not fit with the usual rabble of Fort Smith. His clothes were well made but worn from hard use, his boots were good leather, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence that made other men unconsciously step aside. The gavel started its descent. $200. The man's voice cut through the cold air, deep and steady. The auctioneer's gavel froze in mid-swing. The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs. Otto Brenner spun around, his face reddening. Sarah stared at the stranger, her heart hammering against her ribs. $200 from the gentleman in back. The auctioneer could barely contain his excitement. This was far more than anyone had expected. "Do I hear 210? Otto Brenner stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you?" The tall man moved through the crowd with an easy grace, and Sarah could see him more clearly now. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of slate. A shadow of stubble covered his jaw, and there was a scar along his right cheekbone that suggested a hard life. But his eyes, when they met Sarah's for a brief moment, held something she had not expected: kindness. "Name's Zachary Parrish," he said calmly. "And I believe I just bid $200. $225, Otto shouted, his face now fully red with anger and determination. Zachary did not hesitate. 300. The crowd gasped. That was an enormous sum, more than most of them would see in half a year of work. Sarah could not understand it. Why would a stranger pay so much for her indenture? Otto opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. His hand went to the pocket where he kept his money, and Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. Finally, his shoulders slumped. "This is not over," he muttered, glaring at Zachary before stalking away. $300. The auctioneer crowed. "Going once, going twice, sold. To Mr. Zachary Parrish." The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that the spectacle had ended so abruptly and so expensively. The deputy unlocked Sarah's shackles and pushed her toward the steps. Her legs nearly gave out and she grabbed the railing to steady herself. Zachary was there in an instant, his hand under her elbow supporting her. His touch was gentle but firm. "Easy now," he said quietly. "When did you last eat?" The question surprised her so much that she answered honestly. 2 days ago." His jaw tightened and he shrugged out of his heavy coat, draping it over her shoulders before she could protest. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming. The coat smelled of leather and pine and horses, and it fell almost to her ankles. "Mr. Parrish," the auctioneer called. "If you will come settle your account." "Wait here," Zachary told Sarah, then strode over to the auctioneer's table. Sarah watched as he counted out the money, gold coins that glinted in the weak winter sunlight. $300 in gold. A fortune. And he had spent it on her. Judge Crawley emerged from the courthouse, his considerable bulk wrapped in expensive furs. "Mr. Parrish, I trust you understand the terms of the indenture. The girl is bound to you for a period of no less than 7 years, to work off her father's debts and the cost of her purchase." "I understand the supposed terms," Zachary said, his voice level but with an edge of steel beneath it. "Now let me make my terms clear. I want a full accounting of every debt claimed against Daniel Ellen, with documentation and verification." The judge's eyes narrowed. "The debts are a matter of record. Then producing the records should be no trouble at all." Zachary's smile did not reach his eyes. "I will be at the Garrison Hotel for the next 3 days. You can deliver the documentation there." "Now see here, 3 days, Judge." Zachary touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that somehow managed to be polite and dismissive at the same time, then returned to Sarah. "Can you walk?" she nodded, not trusting her voice. Her mind was spinning with questions, but her body was focused on more immediate concerns: warmth, food, survival. Zachary offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. He led her through the thinning crowd toward a horse tied at the edge of the square, a big buckskin gelding with intelligent eyes. From his saddlebags, Zachary pulled a pair of thick socks and knelt in the frozen mud. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked. "Your feet are bare." He looked up at her, and there was something in his expression that made her throat tight. "May I?" she nodded, and he gently lifted one foot at a time, brushing off the worst of the mud and ice before sliding the warm socks on. They were far too large, but they were wool and dry, and Sarah felt tears sting her eyes at the simple kindness of it. When he stood, she had to look up to meet his gaze. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you do this?" "Because it was wrong," he said simply. and because I could." He led her to the Garrison Hotel, the finest establishment in Fort Smith, which was not saying much, but at least it was clean and warm. The clerk's eyes widened when they entered, taking in Sarah's bedraggled state and Zachary's protective stance. "Mr. Parrish, welcome back. Will you be needing one room or two?" "2 rooms, adjoining if you have them. And send up hot water for baths, food, whatever she wants, and find some proper clothes for the lady. Dress, shoes, a coat, everything she needs. Charge it to my account." The clerk nodded, scribbling notes. "Right away, sir." Sarah found her voice. "I cannot let you spend any more money on me." Zachary looked at her steadily. "Those are not requests for you to accept or decline. Those are necessities I am providing because you need them." He gestured to the stairs. "Room 12 is yours. There is a lock on the door, and you have the only key. I will be in room 14 next door. If you need anything, knock on the adjoining door." "I do not understand any of this," Sarah said, frustration and confusion and exhaustion all warring inside her. "You just spent $300 on my indenture, and now you are treating me like a guest instead of a servant. That is because you are not my servant." Zachary pulled a paper from his inside pocket, the indenture contract the judge had handed over after the payment. In one smooth motion, he tore it in half, then in quarters, then let the pieces fall to the hotel floor. "You are free. I bought your indenture so I could end it. That is all." Sarah stared at the torn pieces of paper, then at Zachary, then back at the paper. "That is not possible. You cannot just $300. Why would you? You should get cleaned up and get some food in you," Zachary said gently. "We can talk more after you have rested." The hotel clerk was back with a young woman carrying an armload of clothes. "These should fit, miss. We will have the bath ready in just a few minutes." Sarah followed the woman upstairs in a daze. The room was simple but clean, with a real bed and curtains on the window and a small stove that was already warming the space. Within minutes, hotel staff brought up a copper tub and filled it with steaming water. The woman, who introduced herself as Betty, helped Sarah out of her filthy dress and into the bath. The hot water was almost painful against her frozen skin, but Sarah sank into it with a sob of relief. Betty left her alone, and Sarah scrubbed away 3 weeks of dirt and fear and shame until her skin was pink and raw. When the water began to cool, she reluctantly climbed out and dried herself with thick towels that felt like luxury against her skin. The clothes Betty had brought were simple but well made: a warm wool dress in deep blue, proper undergarments, stockings, and sturdy boots that actually fit. There was also a brush, and Sarah worked through the tangles in her hair until it fell in dark waves down her back. A knock at the door made her jump. "Miss Ellen, I have your supper," Betty's voice called. Sarah opened the door to find Betty with a tray laden with food: hot beef stew, fresh bread, butter, cheese, apple pie, coffee. The smell alone nearly made Sarah weep. "Mr. Parrish said you were to eat as much as you wanted," Betty said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. She paused, then added quietly, "He is a good man, miss. I have seen many men come through this hotel, and I have learned to rate them. That one, he has honor." When Betty left, Sarah sat down and ate slowly, forcing herself not to make herself sick after days without food. The stew was rich and hot, the bread was soft, and the coffee was strong and sweet. With each bite she felt a bit more human, a bit more real. When she had eaten all she could, she sat in the chair by the window and looked out at Fort Smith. The town square was empty now, the platform already being dismantled. It was hard to believe that just hours ago she had been standing there in shackles, being sold like property. A soft knock on the adjoining door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Ellen, are you decent? May I speak with you?" Sarah went to the door and opened it. Zachary stood in the doorway of the adjoining room, and he had also cleaned up. His hair was damp and combed back, and he had shaved. Without the trail dust and the heavy coat, she could see that he was younger than she had first thought, and strikingly handsome in a rough-hewn way. He had changed into clean clothes, dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. "You look better," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "Did you get enough to eat?" "More than enough." Sarah gestured for him to come in, then remembered propriety and left the door open wide. "Mr. Parrish, I need to understand what is happening." "You said I am free, but that cannot be true. You paid for my indenture, 7 years of labor. That was the contract. A contract I had every right to tear up since I owned it." Zachary leaned against the door frame, his arms crossed. "You owe me nothing, Miss Ellen, not money, not labor, nothing. Tomorrow I will put you on a stage to anywhere you want to go, with enough money to start fresh. Or if you prefer to stay in Fort Smith, I will rent you a room at a boarding house and make sure you have enough to live on until you find work." Sarah shook her head slowly. "Why? People do not do things like this, not without wanting something in return." "Most people do not," Zachary agreed, "but I am not most people." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. 3 years ago, my sister found herself in a situation not unlike yours. Her husband died, left her with debts she could not pay. The town she lived in, they did not auction her off, but they were going to take her children, put them in an orphanage, unless she signed herself over to a man who would have treated her worse than a slave. His jaw clenched. "I was working a cattle drive in Montana, did not even know it was happening until it was too late. By the time I got to her, she had been with this man for 6 months, and what he had done to her." He stopped, took a breath. "I got her out, got her and the children somewhere safe. But I was almost too late." "I am sorry," Sarah said softly. "When I rode into Fort Smith this morning and saw the crowd gathering, saw you up on that platform, I saw my sister. I saw every woman who has been put in an impossible position by men with power and no conscience." He looked at her directly. "I had the money to stop it from happening to you, so I did. That is all." Sarah studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden motive, but all she saw was sincerity. "Where is your sister now?" "California. She remarried last year, a good man who treats her and the children right. She is happy." A smile flickered across his face. "She writes me letters telling me to settle down and find a wife, stop wandering." "Why do you wander?" "Cattle work mostly. I take contracts driving herds, worked my way up to trail boss. The pay is good if you are willing to do the hard work, and I have always been willing." He gestured around. "I finished a drive to Kansas City last week, got paid for 4 months of work. $300, barely made a dent." Sarah absorbed this information. A trail boss made good money, but he had still spent what amounted to 2 months' wages on a stranger. "Your sister raised you well." "Our mother did, actually. She died when I was 16, made me promise to always look out for Catherine. That is my sister. I have tried to honor that promise." He straightened up. "You should rest. We can talk more in the morning about where you want to go." "Mr. Parrish," Sarah said as he turned to leave. "Thank you. I know I have said it before, but I do not think I can say it enough. You saved my life today." "Zachary," he said, "if we are going to be neighbors, even for just a night, you should call me Zachary. Then you should call me Sarah." He smiled, a real smile that transformed his whole face, and Sarah felt something flutter in her chest. "Good night, Sarah." "Good night, Zachary." She closed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She told herself it was just gratitude, just the natural response to someone who had shown her such unexpected kindness. But as she lay in the soft bed that night, warm and safe and free, it was Zachary's face she saw before she fell asleep. The next morning, Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee. For a moment, she did not remember where she was, and panic seized her. Then it all came back: the auction, Zachary, freedom. She sat up and saw that someone had left a tray outside her door, more food, coffee, and a note in a strong, angular hand. "Come next door when you are ready. We need to discuss your plans." Sarah washed her face, braided her hair, and put on the blue dress again. It felt strange to have only one dress after owning several, but at least this one was warm and whole. She picked up the tray and knocked on the adjoining door. "Come in," Zachary called. He was sitting at a small desk, papers spread out before him, and he stood when she entered. "I hope you slept well. Better than I have in weeks." Sarah set down the tray. "What is all this?" "I sent a message to Judge Crawley last night, told him I wanted that documentation by noon today, or I would be taking certain information to the territorial marshal." He tapped the papers. "He sent these over an hour ago." Sarah moved closer and looked at the documents. They were itemized lists of her father's supposed debts. Her eyes widened as she scanned the numbers. "This cannot be right. My father owed money, yes, but not this much. Half of these debts I have never even heard of." "That is what I suspected." Zachary's voice was grim. "Look at the dates. Most of these are dated after your father died." Sarah felt rage building in her chest. "They made them up. They just invented debts to justify selling me. That would be my assessment." Zachary gathered the papers and tapped them into a neat stack, which means the entire auction was fraudulent. "You could press charges against the judge and everyone involved." Sarah laughed bitterly. "Press charges against Judge Crawley in Fort Smith? I would end up in jail myself or worse." "Probably," Zachary admitted. "Which is why I am going to suggest an alternative. Leave Fort Smith. Go somewhere these men have no power over you. Start fresh." "I have been thinking about that all morning." Sarah sat down on the edge of the bed. "I have an aunt in St. Louis, my mother's sister. We have not spoken in years, but she wrote to me after my mother died, said I always had a place with her if I needed it. St. Louis is a good city, lots of opportunities for work." Zachary pulled out a leather wallet and counted out bills. "This is $200. That should cover your stage fare, a train ticket if needed, and enough to live on for several months while you find your feet." Sarah stared at the money. "That is too much." "It is what you need." He held it out to her. "Please, Sarah, take it." She took the bills with trembling hands. "I will pay you back. Somehow, someday, I will pay you back every penny. If it makes you feel better to think that, then think it, but I do not want to expect repayment." He pulled out a pocket watch and checked the time. "There is a stage leaving for Little Rock at 2 o'clock. From there, you can catch a train to St. Louis. I will escort you to the stage office and make sure you get on safely." Sarah nodded, trying to ignore the strange disappointment she felt. This was what she wanted: to leave Fort Smith and never look back. So why did the thought of saying goodbye to Zachary make her chest ache? They had lunch in the hotel dining room, and Sarah marveled at how easy it was to talk to him. He told her about his cattle drives, about seeing the great herds of buffalo in the northern territories, about nights sleeping under stars so thick they looked like spilled milk. She told him about her childhood, about her mother's love of books and how she had taught Sarah to read from her own small collection, about her father's descent into gambling and drinking after her mother died. "He was not always like that," Sarah said quietly. "Before she died, he was different. Kinder, but grief changed him, made him hard and reckless." "Grief does strange things to people," Zachary said. "Some people it makes stronger, others it breaks. Sounds like your father was broken by it. And my mother would have hated what he became, what he left me to face." Sarah looked down at her hands. "I used to be so angry at her for dying, for leaving me alone with him, but she did not choose to leave. She loved me. I am sure she did. Zachary reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. The touch was fleeting but warm, and Sarah felt it all the way to her bones. At 1:30, they walked to the stage office. The streets of Fort Smith were busy with midday traffic, and Sarah was conscious of people staring at her at them. Zachary kept a protective hand at her elbow, and his very presence seemed to warn others to keep their distance. At the stage office, Zachary bought her a ticket to Little Rock and helped her secure a place on the coach. The driver loaded her small bag, just a few items Zachary had bought for her, onto the roof. There were 3 other passengers already seated inside, a middle-aged couple and a young man who looked like a clerk or shopkeeper. "This is it then," Sarah said, turning to face Zachary. "The stage would leave in 10 minutes. I do not know how to say goodbye to you." "Then do not say goodbye. Say until we meet again." Zachary smiled, but there was something sad in his eyes. "Maybe our paths will cross again someday. Maybe they will." Sarah wanted to say more, wanted to tell him that she wished she did not have to leave, that she wished she had met him under different circumstances, that she wished she could have more time to know him. But none of those words would come. "Sarah," Zachary said, and his voice was lower, more intense. "If you ever need anything, anything at all, you can reach me through the Cattlemen's Association in Abilene, Kansas. They always know where to find me, or at least where I am headed next. Promise me you will remember that. I promise." Sarah blinked back tears. "And you remember that there is a woman in St. Louis who owes you her life and her freedom." "I will remember." Zachary took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was gentle and respectful and somehow more intimate than anything Sarah had ever experienced. "Be safe, Sarah Ellen. Be happy." "You too, Zachary Parrish." The driver called that it was time to leave, and Sarah reluctantly climbed into the coach. She took a seat by the window and looked out at Zachary. He stood on the boardwalk, his hat in his hands, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. The driver cracked his whip, and the horses lurched forward. Sarah pressed her hand against the window glass, and Zachary raised his hand in farewell. She watched him until the coach turned a corner and he disappeared from view, and only then did she let the tears fall. The woman sitting across from her offered a handkerchief. There, dear, leaving a sweetheart is always hard." "He is not my sweetheart," Sarah said, but even as she said it, she wondered if that was true. Could you fall for someone in less than 24 hours? Could you feel like a piece of your heart was being left behind with a man you had just met? The journey to Little Rock took 2 days, with overnight stops at way stations. Sarah was grateful for the money Zachary had given her. It allowed her to buy decent meals and a private room at the stations, away from the rough travelers and rougher accommodations. She spent the long hours in the coach thinking about what she would do in St. Louis, how she would explain everything to her aunt, how she would start building a new life. But always, her thoughts returned to Zachary. She wondered where he was, if he was still in Fort Smith, or if he had already moved on to his next job. She wondered if he thought about her at all, or if she was just another good deed in a life full of them. In Little Rock, she bought a train ticket to St. Louis and sent a telegram to her aunt, letting her know she was coming. The train was faster than the stage, but just as crowded, and Sarah spent the journey pressed against the window, watching the landscape change from the rugged hills of Arkansas to the flatter lands of Missouri. St. Louis was bigger than anything Sarah had ever seen, a real city with buildings that stretched toward the sky and streets packed with people and horses and carriages. She felt small and overwhelmed as she stepped off the train, clutching her bag and looking around for her aunt. Sarah Ellen." Sarah turned to see a handsome woman in her late 40s, dressed in a practical traveling suit, hurrying toward her. Margaret Emerson had her mother's eyes and her mother's smile, and Sarah felt tears spring to her own eyes as her aunt pulled her into a fierce hug. "Oh, my dear girl, let me look at you." Margaret held Sarah at arm's length, her eyes scanning her face. "You look so much like Caroline, it is like seeing my sister again." "Aunt Margaret, I am so sorry to impose on you like this." "Nonsense. You are family, and you are always welcome in my home." Margaret took Sarah's bag. "Come, I have a carriage waiting. You can tell me everything on the way." Margaret's home was a comfortable townhouse in a respectable neighborhood, filled with books and comfortable furniture and the smell of baking bread. Over tea and sandwiches, Sarah told her aunt everything about her father's death, the debts, the auction, and Zachary. When she was done, Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "This man, this Zachary Parrish, he sounds remarkable." "He is," Sarah said quietly. "He asked nothing from me, wanted nothing except to help. I do not think I have ever met anyone like him. And you left him in Fort Smith." "What else could I do? He gave me the money to start over, and St. Louis seemed like the best place to do that." Sarah looked at her aunt. "Was I wrong?" Margaret smiled gently. "Only you can answer that, dear. But I will say this, opportunities for a new start come along fairly often. But men like the one you have described, they are rare indeed." Sarah thought about that as Margaret showed her to a small but comfortable bedroom on the second floor. That night, lying in yet another unfamiliar bed, Sarah replayed every conversation she had had with Zachary, every look, every gesture. She thought about the way her heart had raced when he touched her hand, the way she had felt safe for the first time in months when he was near. In the days that followed, Sarah tried to settle into her new life. Margaret helped her find work at a bookshop owned by a friend, and Sarah spent her days surrounded by books and quiet customers. It was pleasant work, and the pay was decent. Margaret refused to take money for room and board, but Sarah insisted on contributing something, so they compromised on a small amount that allowed Sarah to keep her pride. At night, Sarah would sit in her room and write letters. She wrote to Zachary, long letters telling him about St. Louis and her new job and her aunt's kindness. But she never sent them. What would she say? "Thank you again for saving me. I miss you even though I barely know you. I think about you every day and wonder if you think about me." Instead, she folded the letters and kept them in a drawer, a record of feelings she was not brave enough to speak aloud. 6 weeks after Sarah arrived in St. Louis, a letter came for her. Margaret brought it up to her room one evening, her eyes twinkling. "This came in today's post. The return address says Abilene, Kansas." Sarah's hands shook as she took the envelope. Zachary's name was written in the corner in that same strong, angular hand she recognized from the note he had left her at the hotel. She waited until Margaret left before opening it. "Dear Sarah, I hope this letter finds you well and settled in St. Louis. I am writing from Abilene, where I have signed on to boss a cattle drive from Texas to Montana, leaving in 2 weeks. It will be a 4-month job, so I wanted to write before I lost the chance. I have thought about you often since Fort Smith, wondered if you made it safely to your aunt's, if you found work, if you are happy. I know I have no right to ask these things. We barely know each other, but I find that I want to know anyway. If you have the time and the inclination, I would very much like to hear from you. Write to me, care of the Cattlemen's Association in Abilene, and they will forward any letters to me on the trail. I hope you are well. I hope you are free and happy and building the life you deserve. Yours, Zachary Parrish." Sarah read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding harder each time. He had thought about her. He wanted to hear from her. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, and this time she did not stop herself. She told him about St. Louis, about her aunt and the bookshop and the city that was so different from Fort Smith. She told him about the letters she had written but not sent, about how she thought of him more often than was probably proper for a woman who had known a man for barely a day. She told him that she was grateful for everything he had done, but that her gratitude had long since grown into something more complicated, something that felt like the beginning of caring deeply for someone. When she was done, she sealed the letter before she could second-guess herself and posted it the next morning. 3 weeks later, another letter came from Zachary. He was on the trail now, 2 weeks into the drive, and he wrote about the endless sky and the bawling cattle and the men he had hired on. But he also wrote about her letter, about how it had made him smile to read her words, about how he had carried it in his pocket and read it by firelight until he had it memorized. I need to be honest with you, Sarah. I have been trying to figure out what I felt when I met you in Fort Smith, why I could not stop thinking about you after you left. I told myself it was just concern, just wanting to make sure my good deed had worked out. But your letter made me face the truth. I care about you. More than I should for someone I spent less than a day with. More than makes any kind of logical sense. I am not a man who believes in love at first sight or fate or any of that nonsense, but I cannot deny what I feel. When this drive is done, I will be in Montana through the winter. After that, my plan was to head south again, maybe take another contract. But I keep thinking about St. Louis. I keep thinking about a woman in a blue dress who looked at me like I was a hero, when really I was just a man doing what was right. I would very much like to see you again, Sarah. If you would like to see me, if not, I understand and I will not press, but I had to tell you. Yours, Zachary. Sarah sat on her bed and cried, not from sadness but from a joy so intense it overwhelmed her. He felt it too. This impossible, improbable thing that had happened between them, he felt it too. She wrote back immediately, and this time she did not hold back. She told him yes, she wanted to see him again. She told him that she had been trying to talk herself out of her feelings because they did not make sense, but that sense seemed like a small thing compared to what she felt when she thought of him. She told him that she would wait for him, as long as it took. Over the next 4 months, letters flew back and forth between them. Zachary wrote about the drive, about pushing through storms and swollen rivers, about night watches under stars and early mornings pushing reluctant cattle forward. Sarah wrote about the bookshop, about the books she was reading, about St. Louis and her growing friendship with her aunt. But more than the details of their daily lives, they wrote about themselves. Zachary told her about growing up poor in Texas, about his father who drank and his mother who worked herself to death trying to hold the family together. He told her about the first time he went up on a cattle drive, just 16 years old, and determined to make something of himself. He told her about the mistakes he had made, the fights he had been in, the hard years when he was not sure he would survive. Sarah told him about her childhood, about her mother's gentle teaching and her father's slow decline. She told him about the fear she had felt watching their money disappear into gambling and drink, about the shame of being unable to pay their debts, about the terror of standing on that auction block. But she also told him about finding strength she did not know she had, about deciding to live instead of just survive. With each letter, Sarah felt like she was coming to know Zachary in a way that went deeper than surface acquaintance. She knew his hopes and his fears, his pride and his regrets. And she shared her own in return, trusting him with parts of herself she had never shown anyone. In late October, a telegram came. Drive complete. Heading to St. Louis. Will arrive November 15th. May I call on you, Zachary? Sarah's hands shook as she sent a reply. Yes, please come, Sarah. The 2 weeks between the telegram and November 15th felt like the longest of Sarah's life. She found herself distracted at work, staring out the window instead of helping customers. Margaret noticed, of course, and sat Sarah down one evening. "You are in love with him," Margaret said. It was not a question. "I think I have been since Fort Smith," Sarah admitted. "But that is mad, is it not? You cannot fall in love with someone in one day." "Your uncle and I knew each other for 3 hours before we married," Margaret said with a smile. "We met on a Monday, he proposed on a Tuesday, we were married on Wednesday. Everyone said we were insane. We had 32 years together before he passed, and I never once regretted it. I did not know that. Sometimes, my dear, the heart knows what the head has not figured out yet." Margaret squeezed Sarah's hand. "From everything you have told me, from all the letters you have shared, this Zachary sounds like a good man. A man worth taking a chance on. What if he has changed his mind? What if what he felt in the letters is not what he feels when he sees me again? Then you will know, and you will move forward. But what if he has not changed his mind? What if he walks through that door and feels the same way you do?" Margaret's eyes were gentle. "Is not that possibility worth the risk?" On the morning of November 15th, Sarah woke before dawn and could not get back to sleep. She dressed carefully in a new dress she had bought for the occasion, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes. She brushed her hair until it shone and pinned it up in a style that was both elegant and practical. The day crawled by. Sarah tried to work at the bookshop but could barely concentrate. Finally, her employer, a kind man named Mr. Patterson, sent her home early with a knowing smile. "Go on, Miss Ellen. Your mind is clearly not on books today." Sarah went home and paced. Margaret made tea that Sarah did not drink. The clock on the mantel ticked toward evening. Zachary's telegram had said he would arrive on the afternoon train, but he had not specified when he would call. At 6 o'clock there was a knock at the door. Sarah froze. Margaret squeezed her shoulder. "Breathe, dear, then go answer the door." Sarah walked to the door on legs that felt like water. She opened it, and there he was. Zachary stood on the front step, his hat in his hands, looking nervous and hopeful, and exactly as Sarah remembered. He was dressed in clean clothes. His hair was neatly combed, and his eyes, those slate-gray eyes, lit up when he saw her. "Hello, Sarah." "Hello, Zachary." They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. Then Zachary smiled, that transforming smile that made Sarah's heart race, and she smiled back. "May I come in?" he asked. "Yes, yes, of course." Sarah stepped back and Zachary entered the house. Margaret appeared from the parlor and Sarah made introductions. "Aunt Margaret, this is Zachary Parrish." "Zachary, my Aunt Margaret Emerson. Mr. Parrish, I have heard so much about you." Margaret shook his hand warmly. "Please sit down, I will make fresh tea." "Thank you, madam." Zachary sat in the chair Margaret indicated, and Sarah sat on the sofa across from him. For a moment they just looked at each other. "You look well," Zachary said. "St. Louis agrees with you. So do you. Montana must have been good to you." Sarah folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. "How was the drive?" "Long, cold at the end, but successful." Zachary leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Sarah, I have been thinking the whole way here about what I would say when I saw you. I had a whole speech planned out about taking things slow and getting to know each other properly and not rushing into anything. But now that I am here, now that I am looking at you, all of that seems pointless." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I love you." The words came out simple and direct. "I know that is mad. I know we have only spent one day in the same room together, even if we have spent 4 months writing letters. I know it makes no sense. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Sarah Ellen. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you on that platform, looking scared but defiant. I know I finished falling in love with you when I read your first letter and realized that you were brilliant and brave, and everything I did not know I was looking for. Sarah could not breathe, could not think, could only feel the overwhelming rightness of his words. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to because it seemed impossible, but I do. I love you, Zachary." Zachary crossed the space between them in 2 strides and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Then marry me. I know it is fast. I know people will say we are rushing, but I do not want to waste time pretending I have not already decided that you are the one I want to spend my life with." "Marry me, Sarah." "Yes." The word came out without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." Zachary pulled her to her feet and into his arms, and Sarah went willingly. He held her tight and she held him back, and it felt like coming home. Margaret appeared in the doorway with the tea tray and stopped, a smile spreading across her face. "I will just leave this here then," she said, setting the tray down and discreetly withdrawing. Zachary pulled back just enough to look at Sarah's face. "How soon can we be married?" "I do not know. I have to arrange things, and tomorrow," Zachary said. "Or the day after. I do not want to wait, Sarah. I have already wasted too much of my life wandering around looking for something I did not know I needed. Now that I have found you, I do not want to spend another day without you as my wife." Sarah laughed, giddy with joy. "People will think we are insane. Let them think what they want." Zachary cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "What do you want, Sarah? Honestly, I want to marry you," she said. "As soon as possible. Then that is what we will do." They were married 3 days later in a small ceremony at the local church. Margaret stood as Sarah's witness, and Zachary asked Mr. Patterson from the bookshop to stand for him, having no family in the city. Sarah wore a simple white dress that Margaret helped her sew in the 2 days before the wedding, and Zachary wore a new suit that Sarah suspected he had bought specifically for the occasion. The ceremony was short and sweet. Sarah's voice shook as she said her vows, but Zachary's hand was steady in hers, anchoring her. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary kissed her, gentle at first and then deeper, and Sarah felt like her heart would burst from happiness. They had a small celebration at Margaret's house after the ceremony, just the 4 of them and a few of Margaret's friends. Sarah barely tasted the food or heard the conversations, too aware of Zachary beside her, his hand resting on her back, his eyes constantly finding hers across the room. As the evening drew to a close, Margaret pulled Sarah aside. "I have had the guest room prepared for you both," she said quietly. "I know you were planning to find your own place, but that can wait a few days. Tonight should be about the 2 of you. Thank you, Aunt Margaret, for everything." Sarah hugged her aunt. "I do not know what I would have done without you. You would have managed because you are strong, but I am glad I could be here for you." Margaret kissed her cheek. "Be happy, my dear. You deserve it." Upstairs in the guest room, Sarah stood by the window and looked out at the night. She heard the door open and close, felt Zachary's presence behind her. "Are you nervous?" he asked softly. "A little," Sarah admitted. "Everything has happened so fast. Sometimes I worry I will wake up and discover this is all a dream." Zachary came to stand beside her, taking her hand. "It is not a dream. This is real. You and me, we are real." He lifted her hand and pressed it against his chest over his heart. "Feel that? That is real." Sarah felt the steady beat of his heart under her palm and smiled. "It is real," she agreed. They stood there for a moment, just holding each other, letting the reality of their marriage sink in. Then Zachary turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Sarah, I want you to know something. You never have to be afraid with me, of anything. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know you are safe and cherished and loved." "I know," Sarah said, and she meant it. She had never felt safer than she did in this moment with this man who had appeared out of nowhere and changed her entire life. "I love you, Zachary. I love you too." He kissed her then, deep and tender, and Sarah felt any lingering nervousness melt away. This was right. He was right. They were right together. The next morning they lay tangled together in the big bed, watching the sunrise through the window. Sarah traced idle patterns on Zachary's chest, marveling at the solid reality of him beside her. "What happens now?" she asked. "Where do we go from here?" "That depends on what you want," Zachary said. "I have enough money saved to buy us a small ranch if you want to settle down somewhere. Or I can take another trail boss contract and you can come with me. Or we can do something else entirely. I am open to possibilities." Sarah thought about it. "I like the idea of a ranch. Somewhere we can build something of our own. But where?" "There is good land in Colorado," Zachary said thoughtfully. "In the valleys east of the mountains. The cattle business is growing there and land is still affordable. We could get a few hundred acres, start small, build up over time." "Colorado," Sarah repeated, testing the word. "I have never been west of Arkansas." "It is beautiful country, hard but beautiful, and full of opportunity for people willing to work." Zachary stroked her hair. "But only if you want to. We can stay here in St. Louis if you prefer." Sarah shook her head. "I love my aunt and I am grateful for her help, but St. Louis is not home. I want to go somewhere new, start fresh with you. Colorado sounds perfect." "Then Colorado it is." Zachary kissed the top of her head. "We will leave in the spring, after the worst of the winter weather is past. That gives us a few months to plan and prepare." Over the next weeks, they made their plans. Zachary sold his services as a consultant to local cattlemen, using his expertise to advise on breeding and range management. The pay was good, and it allowed them to save more money for their future ranch. Sarah continued working at the bookshop, and in the evenings, she and Zachary would sit together and plan their future. They pored over maps of Colorado, researching different valleys and towns. They made lists of supplies they would need, equipment for ranching, seeds for a garden, tools for building. Margaret helped Sarah sew quilts and curtains, practical things they would need for a frontier home. At night, Sarah would lie in Zachary's arms and listen to him talk about his dreams for their ranch. He wanted to breed good cattle, sturdy animals that could handle the Colorado winters. He wanted to build a solid house, nothing fancy but well-made and comfortable. He wanted to create something that would last, something they could pass down to their children someday. Children. The thought made Sarah both nervous and excited. She had never really thought about being a mother, too focused on simple survival to imagine a future that included family. But now, with Zachary, it seemed not only possible but desirable. Christmas came, and Sarah experienced her first real Christmas in years. Margaret decorated the house with pine boughs and candles, and they all exchanged small gifts. Zachary gave Sarah a beautiful leather-bound journal, and she gave him a new hat that she had saved for weeks to buy. It was simple and perfect, and Sarah felt her heart swell with contentment. On New Year's Eve, as 1885 approached, Zachary pulled Sarah aside. "1 year ago, I was in a bunkhouse in Kansas, drunk and alone, wondering what I was doing with my life. Now I am here with you, planning a future I never even let myself dream about. You have changed everything, Sarah." "You changed everything for me first," Sarah said. "You gave me freedom and hope and love. Everything good in my life now traces back to you." "Then we saved each other," Zachary said, and kissed her as the church bells rang in the new year. In March, when the worst of the winter weather had passed, they said goodbye to Margaret and boarded a train west. Margaret cried as she hugged Sarah, made them promise to write often, and pressed a bag of coins into Sarah's hand. "For emergencies," she said, "and do not even think about refusing. You are family, and family takes care of each other. The train journey took them through Kansas and into Colorado, and Sarah pressed her face to the window, marveling at the vast openness of the landscape. The mountains appeared on the western horizon, jagged and still snow-capped, and Sarah understood what Zachary meant about the country being beautiful. They got off the train in Colorado Springs and bought a wagon and 2 horses. Zachary had been corresponding with a land agent, and they had identified a promising piece of property in a valley about 30 miles north, near a small settlement called Monument. The journey to the valley took 2 days, and Sarah experienced frontier travel for the first time. They camped under the stars, and Zachary showed her how to make coffee over an open fire and how to read the night sky for direction. It was hard and uncomfortable, but also exhilarating. When they arrived at their land, Sarah stood in the middle of 300 acres of grassland and felt tears sting her eyes. It was beautiful, a valley nestled against the foothills, with a creek running through it and views of the mountains to the west. There was a small cabin already on the property, built by a previous owner who had given up, and while it was rough, it was shelter. "What do you think?" Zachary asked, his arm around her waist. "I think it is perfect," Sarah said. "I think it is home." They spent the next months working from dawn to dark. Zachary repaired and expanded the cabin while Sarah planted a garden and established a chicken coop. They bought cattle, just 20 head to start, and Zachary built corrals and shelters. The work was back-breaking, but they did it together, and every night they fell into bed exhausted but content. Their nearest neighbors were the Johnsons, a family with a ranch 5 miles east. Emma Johnson rode over one day, curious about the newcomers, and she and Sarah became fast friends. The Johnsons had 3 children, and Emma was pregnant with her 4th. She taught Sarah about frontier life, about preserving food and treating common ailments and dealing with the isolation. "It is not an easy life," Emma told her one afternoon as they worked together in Sarah's garden. "But it is a good one if you have the right person beside you, and from what I have seen, you and Zachary are well matched." "I think so too," Sarah said, looking over at where Zachary was working with Emma's husband, building a new section of fence. Even from a distance, she could see the easy competence in his movements, the strength in his shoulders. He caught her looking and grinned, and Sarah grinned back. That summer, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She told Zachary one evening after supper, nervous about his reaction even though they had talked about wanting children. Zachary's face went through several emotions in quick succession: shock, joy, fear, and then settled on a smile so wide it made Sarah laugh. "Really? We are going to have a baby." "In the winter, I think, February or March." Sarah took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not begin to cover it," Zachary said. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "We are going to be parents, Sarah. We are going to have a family." The pregnancy was not easy. Sarah had morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon, and the physical work of the ranch became harder as she grew larger. But Zachary was attentive and protective, taking on extra work so Sarah could rest, bringing her water and food, worrying over her constantly. "I am fine," Sarah told him for the 100th time one day in December. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "I know," Zachary said. "But none of those women were my wife carrying my child." Emma Johnson came to stay with them 2 weeks before Sarah's due date, bringing experience and calm competence. When Sarah went into labor on a freezing February night, Emma was there to help, coaching Sarah through the contractions while Zachary paced outside, too nervous to be useful. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Sarah was not sure she could continue. But Emma was steady and encouraging, and Sarah focused on the thought of holding her baby, of giving Zachary the family he wanted. Finally, in the early morning hours, a baby's cry filled the cabin. Emma wrapped the infant in a blanket and placed him in Sarah's arms. "You have a son," she said with a smile. Sarah looked down at the tiny, red-faced baby and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. He was perfect, all 10 fingers and 10 toes, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be gray like his father's. Zachary came into the cabin, his face pale and anxious. "Sarah, are you all right?" "I am fine," Sarah said, smiling through her tears. "Come meet your son." Zachary approached slowly, almost reverently, and Sarah placed the baby in his arms. She watched as he looked down at their son, saw the moment when the reality of fatherhood hit him, the awe and terror and overwhelming love. "He is so small," Zachary whispered. "So perfect." "What should we name him?" Sarah asked. Zachary thought for a moment. "Daniel, after your father." "He was not perfect, but he gave me you in a roundabout way. I would like to honor that." Sarah nodded, touched by the gesture. "Daniel Parrish. I like that." They settled into parenthood with the same determination they brought to everything else. Sarah learned to function on little sleep, to nurse the baby while cooking dinner, to comfort him when he cried. Zachary was a devoted father, taking Daniel with him on simple chores, talking to him constantly even though the baby was too young to understand. The ranch continued to grow. They added more cattle, expanded their grazing land, built a proper barn. Zachary's reputation as a cattleman grew, and other ranchers sought his advice. Sarah started a small business selling eggs and butter to the settlement in Monument, and the extra income helped them weather the lean times. 2 years after Daniel was born, Sarah had another child, a daughter they named Caroline after Sarah's mother. Then, 2 years after that, another son they named Matthew. The cabin grew crowded with children and noise and life, and Sarah had never been happier. On a summer evening when Daniel was 6, Caroline was 4, and Matthew was 2, Sarah and Zachary sat on the porch and watched the children play in the yard. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "You ever think about Fort Smith?" Sarah asked. "About that day in the town square?" "Sometimes," Zachary admitted. "I think about how close I came to not being there, to not seeing you. I almost stayed in Kansas that winter, almost took a different route south. A dozen small decisions that could have gone differently, and I never would have met you." "Fate," Sarah said, "maybe, or maybe just luck. Either way, I am grateful for it." Zachary took her hand, his thumb tracing familiar patterns on her palm. "You know, I never told you this, but when I first saw you on that platform, I had a moment where I thought about just walking away. It was not my business, not my problem. But then you lifted your head, and even though you were scared, you looked defiant. Like you were determined not to let them break you, and I thought, that is a woman worth fighting for." "I am glad you decided to fight," Sarah said softly. "I am glad you decided I was worth $300 and all the trouble that came with me." "Best money I ever spent," Zachary said. "Best decision I ever made." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play. Daniel was showing Caroline how to catch grasshoppers while Matthew toddled after them, determined to keep up with his older siblings. "We have built a good life," Sarah said. "A life I never could have imagined when I was standing on that platform, freezing and terrified." "We have built it together," Zachary corrected. "Every piece of it." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they called the children inside for supper. The cabin was warm and bright with lamplight, filled with the chatter of children and the smell of cooking food. Sarah moved around her kitchen, serving plates and settling arguments and wiping faces, and felt a contentment so deep It was almost painful. After the children were in bed, Sarah and Zachary sat together by the fire. Zachary had his arm around her and Sarah leaned against his shoulder, perfectly content. "I love you," she said. "I do not say it enough, but I do. I love you more than I can put into words." "I love you too," Zachary said. "Every day, more than the day before." The years continued to pass, measured in seasons and harvests and the growth of their children. The ranch prospered, growing from 300 acres to over 1,000. They built a larger house to accommodate their growing family, with real glass windows and wood floors and separate bedrooms for the children. Daniel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books as much as cattle. Caroline was spirited and adventurous, always climbing trees or racing her horse across the fields. Matthew was gentle and artistic, more interested in drawing what he saw than in roping and branding. Sarah taught all of them to read and write, using the books she accumulated over the years and the knowledge her own mother had given her. Zachary taught them about ranching and horses and the practical skills they would need to survive in frontier Colorado. Together, they taught them about kindness and honor and the importance of helping others. When Daniel was 15, a family arrived at their ranch late one night, desperate and hungry. The father had lost his job in Denver, and they were trying to get to relatives in Kansas. They had nothing, no money, no food, no hope. Sarah fed them and gave them a place to sleep. Zachary hired the father to help with the spring roundup, giving him work and wages. When the family left a month later, they had enough money to reach Kansas and start fresh. Daniel watched the wagon drive away and turned to his parents. "You did not have to help them," he said. "They were strangers." "That is exactly why we had to help them," Zachary said, "because strangers helped me once when I needed it most." "Because your mother was once in a desperate situation, and someone chose to help her instead of walking away. We help because we can, and because it is the right thing to do." Sarah saw the understanding dawn in her son's eyes, and she knew that the lessons they were teaching were taking root. Time moved on. The children grew and eventually left to build their own lives. Daniel became a lawyer, using his love of books and learning to fight for justice. Caroline married a rancher from a neighboring county, and she and her husband built a successful spread of their own. Matthew moved to Denver and became an artist, his paintings of the Colorado landscape gaining recognition and acclaim. Sarah and Zachary grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down. They hired hands to do the heavy work of the ranch, and they spent their days working in the garden, riding across their land, and enjoying the peace they had built. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house was full of laughter and noise, 3 generations of family connected by the love Sarah and Zachary had started. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Sarah and Zachary walked out to the creek that ran through their property. The moon was full, casting silver light across the water and the grass. 30 years, Sarah said. "It seems impossible and also like no time at all." "I remember every day," Zachary said, "from the moment I saw you in Fort Smith to this moment right now. Every joy, every struggle, every ordinary moment in between. I would not change a single thing." "Not even the hard times?" Sarah asked. "Not even the year the drought nearly broke us, or when we lost the north pasture to fire, or when Caroline got so sick we thought we might lose her?" "Not even those," Zachary said firmly, "because we got through them together and they made the good times sweeter. Every moment, good or bad, brought us here. To this life, this family, this love. I would not trade it for anything." Sarah leaned against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, just as he had done 1,000 times before. She thought about the terrified young woman she had been, standing on an auction block in Fort Smith, certain her life was over. She thought about the stranger who had stepped forward to save her, asking nothing in return. She thought about falling in love through letters, about taking a leap of faith into marriage, about building a life from nothing in the Colorado wilderness. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For saving me, for loving me, for giving me this beautiful life." "Thank you for saying yes," Zachary replied. "For trusting me, for loving me back, for being my partner in all of this." They stood by the creek for a long time, holding each other under the stars, content in the life they had built and the love they shared. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and new sorrows. They lost friends and neighbors to illness and accident. They celebrated the births of more grandchildren. They watched the West change around them, as railroads connected distant towns and electricity reached even their remote valley. When Sarah was 68 and Zachary was 73, they made the decision to sell the ranch to Daniel and his family, who had moved back to Colorado to be near them. They kept the house and a few acres around it, enough for a garden and some chickens, and they spent their final years in the peace they had earned. Sarah took up her old love of reading again, going through book after book, often reading aloud to Zachary in the evenings. Zachary whittled and told stories to the grandchildren who came to visit, passing down the history of their family and the values that had sustained it. One spring morning, Zachary did not wake up. He passed peacefully in his sleep, his hand in Sarah's, his face calm and content. Sarah held him and wept, not for his death but for the inevitable separation it brought. She had known this day would come, had known that one of them would eventually have to face life without the other, but knowing did not make it easier. She buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch with a simple marker that read, "Zachary Parrish, beloved husband and father, 1855–1928. He lived with honor." Sarah lived for another 5 years after Zachary's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She spent her days in the garden, and her evenings writing in the journal Zachary had given her that first Christmas, recording the story of their life together so that future generations would know where they came from. On a warm summer evening in 1933, Sarah sat on her porch and watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink, just as she had done 1,000 times before. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the frozen town square of Fort Smith to this peaceful valley in Colorado. She thought about Zachary, about the love that had sustained her through nearly 50 years of marriage and the 5 years since his death. She thought about the children they had raised, the lives they had touched, the legacy they had built. She thought about the terrified young woman on the auction block and the kind stranger who had saved her, not knowing that he was saving himself too. As the last light faded from the sky, Sarah closed her eyes and felt a peace settle over her. She had lived a good life, a full life, a life rich with love and purpose and meaning. She had been given a second chance that day in Fort Smith, and she had made the most of it. When Daniel found her the next morning, she was still sitting in her chair on the porch, her journal open on her lap to the last entry she had written. Her face was calm and smiling, as if she had simply drifted off to sleep. They buried her next to Zachary on the hill with a marker that matched his. Sarah Parrish, beloved wife and mother, 1862–1933. She lived with grace. The ranch continued on, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story. But it all began with a freezing day in Fort Smith, Arkansas, with a woman on an auction block and a cowboy who decided that some things were worth fighting for. The legacy of Sarah and Zachary lived on in their descendants, in the values they had taught, and the example they had set. They had shown that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that kindness could change lives, that two people willing to work together could build something that would last far beyond their own years. Daniel kept his mother's journals and eventually published them as a book, a record of frontier life and enduring love that touched readers across the country. Caroline's ranch became one of the most successful in the county, known for its quality cattle and fair treatment of workers. Matthew's paintings hung in galleries and museums, capturing the beauty of the Colorado landscape his parents had loved. And every year, on the anniversary of that cold January day in 1884, the family would gather at the ranch to remember and celebrate. They would stand on the hill where Sarah and Zachary were buried and tell the story again, about the auction in the freezing town square, about the cowboy who outbid everyone and set her free, about the love that grew from that single act of kindness. It was a story about courage and compassion, about taking chances and building dreams, about the power of love to transform lives and create legacies. It was a story that began with an ending and ended with a beginning, with roots planted deep in Colorado soil and branches reaching toward the endless western sky. And though Sarah and Zachary were gone, their love remained, woven into the fabric of the ranch, the family, and the land they had loved. It was there in the way Daniel fought for justice for those who could not fight for themselves. It was there in the way Caroline ran her ranch with both strength and kindness. It was there in the way Matthew captured beauty and shared it with the world. Most of all, it was there in the way each generation learned to help strangers, to stand up against injustice, to build lives based on love and honor and hard work. The lessons Sarah and Zachary had lived became the foundation their family was built on, a legacy more valuable than land or money or fame. Their great-grandchildren grew up hearing the story, learning about the great-great-grandmother who had stood on an auction block and the great-great-grandfather who had saved her. Some of them found it romantic, some found it inspiring, but all of them understood that they existed because of a single choice made on a freezing January day, a choice to help someone who needed it, a choice that changed everything. The ranch itself became a landmark, featured in history books about frontier Colorado and the development of the cattle industry. Scholars came to study the journals Sarah had left behind, using them to understand the reality of women's lives in the Old West. The house was preserved, turned into a museum that told the story of the Parrish family and the broader history of the region. But more than any historical significance, more than any academic interest, the ranch remained a home. It was where the family gathered for holidays and celebrations, where children learned to ride and rope and work the land, where stories were told and traditions were maintained. On the 100th anniversary of Sarah and Zachary's wedding, over 200 descendants gathered at the ranch. They came from across the country, lawyers and artists and ranchers and teachers, all connected by the love story that had started it all. Daniel's granddaughter, herself named Sarah, stood on the porch of the old house and looked out at the assembled family. She held the original journal, the one Zachary had given Sarah for Christmas in 1884, carefully preserved and passed down through the generations. "Our family began with an act of courage," she told the gathered crowd. Not just the courage of Zachary Parrish, who stood up against injustice and saved a stranger, but also the courage of Sarah Ellen, who chose to trust, to hope, to love. They could have let fear and caution hold them back. They could have chosen the safe path, the expected path. Instead, they chose each other, and in doing so, they chose all of us. She opened the journal to the last entry Sarah had written, the night before she died. My beloved Zachary has been gone for 5 years now, but I still feel his presence every day. I see him in our children's faces, hear him in our grandchildren's laughter. The life we built together continues, growing and changing but rooted in the love we shared. If I could go back to that frozen day in Fort Smith, knowing everything that would come after, all the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and struggles, I would not change a single thing. Because all of it, every moment brought me to this life, this family, this love. And it was worth it. Every moment was worth it. There was not a dry eye in the crowd when she finished. The family stood together, connected across generations by the enduring power of Sarah and Zachary's love. And they celebrated not just a wedding anniversary, but a legacy of courage, kindness, and devotion that would continue long into the future. As the sun set behind the mountains that evening, painting the sky in those familiar shades of gold and pink, the family gathered on the hill where Sarah and Zachary were buried. They stood in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts about love and legacy and the choices that shape our lives. And if the wind that whispered through the grass carried with it an echo of laughter, the warmth of a touch, the strength of a love that had conquered time and death itself, well, perhaps that was just the spirit of the ranch, the spirit of Sarah and Zachary, reminding their descendants that love, true love, never really ends. It simply changes form, flowing from one generation to the next, a river of connection and devotion that began with two people who chose to take a chance on each other, who chose to build something beautiful from the ashes of despair, who chose love over fear, hope over resignation, together over alone. And in the end, that choice, that simple choice made on a freezing day in Fort Smith, Arkansas, in the winter of 1884, became the foundation of a family, a legacy, and a love story that would endure long after the last cowboy had ridden off into the sunset and the Wild West had faded into memory and myth. It was a story of transformation and redemption, of second chances and new beginnings, of the extraordinary power of ordinary kindness. It was a story about a woman who was auctioned off in a freezing town square, and a cowboy who outbid everyone and set her free, and in setting her free, freed himself to love and be loved in return. And it was a story that, once told, would never be forgotten, would never lose its power to move and inspire, because at its heart, it was a story about the best of what humans can be, the courage to act when action is needed, the wisdom to love when love is offered, and the strength to build something lasting from the briefest of moments. The legacy of Sarah and Zachary Parrish lived on, not just in the land they had claimed and the family they had raised, but in the example they had set and the love they had shared. It was a legacy written in journal entries and family stories, in the values passed from parent to child, in the way their descendants approached the world with kindness and courage, and an unshakable belief in the power of love to change everything. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the valley, and the mountains stood sentinel against the darkening sky, those who knew where to listen could still hear it, the echo of a love story that began with an ending and ended with forever, a love that had transformed two lives and created a legacy that would endure as long as the mountains themselves.